Russia is the largest country on Earth. It covers 11 time zones, spans 2 continents, and borders 14 different countries. No nation in history has ever controlled this much land. But here's what's strange. In 1983, one single Russian officer sat alone in a bunker and decided not to press a button. That decision saved every human being alive on this planet. That's the kind of history Russia has, and this is just the beginning. For 1,500 years, the Mongols destroyed it, Napoleon destroyed it, Hitler destroyed it. All 3 of them lost. And every single time, Russia came back bigger and scarier than before. Russia's greatest weapon was never its army. It was something no enemy ever saw coming. Let's start at the very beginning. About 1,500 years ago, the land we now call Russia was just trees, bogs, and tribes called the Slavs. And they had one big problem. They could not stop fighting each other. Eventually, they got so sick of it that they did something bizarre. According to legend, they invited the Vikings to come and rule them. Imagine being so bad at running your own villages that you call the Vikings for help. A Viking warrior named Rurik showed up, looked around at the cold swampland and said, "Yeah, alright." Rurik's family built a kingdom called Kievan Rus. Look at this map. See this territory stretching from the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Black Sea? That's Kievan Rus. It grew fast, trading with the Byzantine Empire to the south and Scandinavia to the north. But Europe thought the Russians were strange because they still worshipped thunder gods. So Prince Vladimir decided Russia needed a proper religion. He invited every major religion to pitch in.
Right, religion guys, sell me your product. You first, Muslim man.
Islam is beautiful. No pork, no alcohol.
No alcohol.
None.
Russia cannot live without drinking. Next.
Try Judaism.
Where's your homeland?
We, don't really have one right now.
Sounds like a losing team. Next.
We have beautiful buildings, gold everywhere, and you can drink.
Sold!
Christianity won, mostly because they allowed drinking. And just like that, an entire country became Christian because the boss said so. Kievan Rus grew into a real medieval power, but when Vladimir's family died out, the kingdom shattered back into dozens of squabbling little princes, each fighting over scraps of land, which was the worst possible timing because the most terrifying people in human history were about to come riding in from the east. In 1237, while the Russian princes were busy fighting each other, an army appeared on the horizon. These were the Mongols, led by Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan himself. See this enormous empire stretching from China all the way to Eastern Europe? The Mongols had already conquered all of it before they even reached Russia. They could ride 100 miles in a single day, shoot arrows backwards at full gallop, and their armies almost never lost. City by city, they burned Russia to the ground. Kiev, the proud capital of Kievan Rus, got so completely flattened that travelers passing through reported nothing but empty fields and ash. For the next 240 years, every Russian prince had to travel east and personally ask the Mongol Khan for permission to rule his own town. The Khan might say yes, he might also have the prince executed on the spot. It was a coin flip every visit. But something interesting happened in one small, boring town up in the north, Moscow. Moscow's princes had volunteered to collect gold from the other Russian princes on behalf of the Mongols. And every time they did, they skimmed a little off the top. Just enough, never too much. Where's the gold?
Right there, exactly what you asked for.
You're being weirdly nice. The other princes scream at me.
The other princes are amateurs. Vodka?
Year after year, decade after decade, Moscow got quietly and dangerously rich. By 1480, the Mongol Empire was falling apart, so Moscow's prince, Ivan III, decided he was officially done paying. The two armies lined up on opposite sides of a river. Both sides stared at each other for weeks. Then the Mongol commander looked at the snow, turned his horse around, and rode home. That was it. 240 years of Mongol occupation ended without a single battle. Ivan III walked back to Moscow and decided the title Prince was beneath him. He borrowed the most prestigious title he could find. The old Roman emperors had called themselves Caesar. The Russian version was Tsar. Moscow had spent centuries learning how power works. Now, it finally had all of it. And when one person controls everything, you don't get stability. You get Ivan. In 1547, Ivan III's grandson became the first officially crowned Tsar of all Russia. His name was Ivan IV. He was 16 years old, sharp, ambitious, and surprisingly good at his job. He built schools, wrote laws, and won wars against the leftover Mongol kingdoms to the east. Look at this map. See this territory expanding southward and eastward? That's Ivan, adding land fast. And then his beloved wife Anastasia died. Ivan was convinced his own nobles had poisoned her, and what came next was utterly insane. Ivan invented a brand new secret police force called the Oprichnina. They rode around the country dressed entirely in black, on black horses, with severed dog heads tied to their saddles. Their job was simple: kill anyone Ivan didn't like. So they did. They killed nobles, merchants, and on a bad day, wiped out entire towns. The people of Russia gave Ivan a new nickname: Grozny. English translates it as the Terrible, but it more accurately means the one you should definitely not make angry. Honestly, I think terrible is being kinda generous.
New rule, we can't look Ivan in the eye anymore.
Since when?
Since this morning. Last guy who looked at him got thrown out the window. I miss when he was just a regular murderer.
Ivan's worst moment came inside his own family. In a furious argument with his oldest son, Ivan grabbed his royal staff and hit him in the head with it. His son died a few days later. Russia's future Tsar, killed by his own father in a tantrum. Ivan eventually died, broken and miserable. His remaining son was so weak he died with no children of his own. Russia suddenly had no Tsar. What happened next was so bad that the Russians literally named it the Time of Troubles. Famine, plague, and civil war tore the country apart. Poland invaded and put their own man on the throne. 3 different random guys showed up claiming to be Ivan's dead son come back to life. 2 of them somehow became Tsar anyway. After 15 years of pure chaos, the exhausted Russian nobles grabbed a quiet 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov and made him Tsar just to make the madness stop. His family, the Romanovs, would sit on the Russian throne for the next 300 years. But the Russia they inherited wouldn't stay the same for long. By the late 1600s, Europe had completely transformed. Other countries had massive ocean-going ships, gunpowder cannons, real science, and fancy palaces. Russia, meanwhile, still had beards and serfs. Serfs were peasants who basically belonged to the local landowner like furniture. Look at this map. While European empires were spreading across the entire globe, Russia was sitting completely still. Russia was stuck about 200 years behind everyone else. Until Peter. Peter was born in 1672, and from the very beginning, he was different. By the time he was an adult, he stood 6 feet 8 inches tall. In an era where the average European man was about 5 feet tall, Peter towered over everyone like a giant. He also had a borderline insane obsession with ships, science, and working with his own hands. And when he became Tsar at 25, he did something no Russian ruler had ever done. He left Russia. He went on a tour across Europe in disguise, wearing regular workman's clothes and a fake name. He worked in shipyards in Holland with his own bare hands, learning how to build a real European warship. Everywhere he went, people figured out who he was almost immediately, because he was a 6'8" Russian giant pretending to be an ordinary carpenter. But everyone politely played along. When he came home, he was a man on a mission. Russia was gonna catch up with Europe, or else. His first target was beards. Russian noblemen had worn long, glorious beards for centuries. Peter thought they looked embarrassing, so he announced a beard tax. If you wanted to keep yours, you paid a serious fee and carried a metal token to prove it. If you couldn't pay, you got shaved on the spot. And sometimes Peter himself would do the shaving, with a razor, while making direct eye contact with you.
Sir, the nobles are losing their minds about the beard rule. Good, they needed losing.
One of them sees cutting his beard was like cutting his soul.
And his soul?
Still seems to be there, sir.
Excellent. Go cut off another one.
He banned traditional Russian dresses. He forced his nobles into European jackets and wigs. He even changed the calendar overnight. Russia had been counting years from the supposed creation of the world, making it officially the year 7207. Peter switched to the European calendar, and Russia jumped backward in time by 5,000 years before breakfast. Then he decided Russia needed a brand new capital city. A modern European one, facing the sea. The only problem was the perfect spot he chose was a freezing mosquito-infested swamp at the edge of the Baltic Sea. Look at this map. See that dot right there at the very edge of Russia, pressing against the water? Yeah, that's where Peter decided to build. Tens of thousands of forced laborers died constructing it. Peter named it St. Petersburg. It is genuinely beautiful and still stands today. By the time Peter died in 1725, he had built a navy from nothing, won wars against Sweden, and dragged his entire country kicking and screaming into the modern world. Look at this map. When Peter took to the throne, Russia was this. When he died, it was this. He had transformed a backward kingdom into an empire, but keeping it together was a different story. After Peter died, Russia had a messy 40 years of weak heirs and palace coups. Then, in 1762, Peter's useless great-grandson married a clever young German princess named Catherine. 6 months into his reign, Catherine had him overthrown by her friends in the army and took the throne herself. She called herself Catherine the Great, just like Peter the Great, but she actually earned it. Look at this map. See these enormous chunks of land being added to Russia's borders? That's Catherine. She took huge pieces of Poland, grabbed Crimea from the Ottoman Turks, and absorbed most of what is now Ukraine. The empire had never been bigger. She also wrote long, flowery letters to French philosophers about freedom and the rights of man, dropping heavy hints that she was going to free the serfs. Wait, she did not free the serfs? Huh. I don't know what to do with that information either. Anyway, then in 1812, long after Catherine was dead, something genuinely catastrophic happened. A short Frenchman called Napoleon Bonaparte decided to invade Russia, with 600,000 soldiers. Look at this map. See these arrows pushing deep into Russian territory? That's the largest army Europe had ever assembled, marching straight toward Moscow. Nobody believed Russia could survive.
So, we took Moscow! Excellent! Mais where are the Russians? I want their surrender! They left, sir, and burned the city before they went. Huh? They burned their own capital? Also, sir, winter is coming. How bad could it be? Sir, we're in Russia.
Napoleon retreated. Of these 600,000 men who had marched in, only about 30,000 limped out alive. The rest froze to death, starved in the snow, or got picked off by furious Russian peasants armed with pitchforks. Russia had beaten the greatest military genius in Europe using a weapon nobody else had: winter. But Russia hadn't fixed any of its real problems. The serfs were still miserable, the Tsars refused to change a single thing, and after their most glorious victory ever, ordinary Russians were starting to ask why they still lived in a medieval nightmare. In 1894, a brand new Tsar named Nicholas II took over, and almost everyone who knew him personally thought he should not be allowed to run a small bakery, let alone the largest country on earth. He was shy, weak, easily confused, and easily bullied. His wife Alexandria became obsessed with a wild peasant monk called Rasputin. Rasputin was tall, smelled like a goat, and claimed he could magically heal the royal couple's sick son. Alexandra thought he'd been sent directly from God, and through her, Rasputin was basically running the country. Russia, meanwhile, was falling apart. Factory workers were starving, peasants wanted land, and in dark basements all over the country, young revolutionaries were making bombs and dreaming of overthrow. In 1914, Nicholas made the single worst decision any Russian ruler had ever made. He joined World War I. Look at this map. See this enormous front line stretching from the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Black Sea? Russia was fighting along all of it, all at once. And they were completely unprepared. Russian factories couldn't make rifles fast enough, so soldiers were told to pick up the weapons of dead comrades when their own turn came. They marched into freezing winters without proper coats, often without boots, while their families starved back home. At a single battle called Tannenberg, the Germans surrounded an entire Russian army and slaughtered or captured 170,000 men in 3 days. The Russian commander walked off into the woods and shot himself. Russia would go on to lose more soldiers in World War I than any other country on Earth. Almost 2 million men dead. 5 million were wounded. Now I have to tell you about Rasputin's death, because it was probably the strangest death in all of Russian history. A group of nobles decided he had to go. They fed him enough cyanide to kill 5 large men. He asked for more. They shot him, he got up, they shot him 3 more times, wrapped him in a blanket, and threw him into a freezing river. When the police pulled his body out days later, his hands were clawed. He had tried to swim out from under the ice. The man simply refused to die.
Sir, the army is collapsing. Soldiers are deserting in thousands.
Oh dear.
The people are rioting in the streets, sir.
Have you tried asking them nicely to stop?
They threw rocks at us.
Let me ask Rasputin.
Sir, Rasputin is dead.
Then what are we paying him for?
In February 1917, the workers and soldiers finally stormed the palace. Nicholas tried to take a train back home to his family. The train was stopped on the tracks by his own generals. He was politely informed that he was no longer Tsar. 300 years of Romanov rule ended quietly in a train carriage with a confused man signing a piece of paper. Nicholas was gone. A weak new provincial government took over, and their very first big decision was to keep fighting World War I. Everyone in Russia hated the war. This was not a smart move. Meanwhile, hiding in a tiny apartment in Switzerland, there was a bald, angry, brilliant man called Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was a hardcore communist who believed the workers should rise up, overthrow the rich, and run everything themselves. Germany, still at war with Russia, had a sneaky idea. What if they sent Lenin home and let him wreck Russia from the inside? So, they put Lenin on a sealed train and shipped him across Europe like a human bomb. It worked even better than they had hoped. Lenin's party, the Bolsheviks, had 3 simple promises: peace, land, bread. End the war, hand out land to the peasants, put food on every table. In a country that was starving, freezing, and exhausted, that was the most attractive sales pitch anyone had ever heard. Should we wait for an election? No. Should we make a plan?
We just take over. The government is weak. Nobody will stop us.
Huh? Fair. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks walked into the government building in Petrograd to take over. The guards barely fought them. Some just put down their rifles and went home. The most powerful communist revolution in history basically started with a small group of angry men walking through an unlocked door. A brutal civil war followed. The communist Reds against the anti-communist Whites. Look at this map. See these different colored territories pulling Russia in every direction? At one point, 14 foreign countries, including Britain, France, and America, all sent troops into Russia to try and stop the Bolsheviks. It didn't work. The Bolsheviks also took care of one last loose end. They took Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and all 5 of their children down into a basement and shot every last one of them. Just to be sure. 5 years later, the Reds won. A brand new country was born, the Soviet Union, the USSR. Look at this map. See this enormous red landmass covering 1/6 of the entire planet? That is the country Lenin built. Lenin died of a stroke in 1924, and a quiet, paranoid little Georgian man called Joseph Stalin was about to take over absolutely everything. Stalin was short, paranoid, and had the emotional range of a damp rock. Lenin himself, on his deathbed, had specifically warned the other communists not to let Stalin take over. They didn't listen. Big mistake. By 1929, Stalin had outplayed every rival and become the absolute dictator of the Soviet Union. Look at this map. See this entire landmass from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean? One man controlled all of it. He launched 2 enormous projects at once. First, he forced every farmer in Russia and Ukraine off their land and onto giant government-run farms. Anyone who resisted got shot or shipped to labor camps in Siberia. The new farms were a disaster and millions starved to death, especially in Ukraine. Stalin did not care. Second, he built factories everywhere, as fast as possible, no matter how many workers died doing it. Then, in the late 1930s, Stalin got it into his head that everyone around him was plotting against him. His solution was simple. He killed everyone he was suspicious of. His top generals, his most brilliant scientists, and many of his closest friends. By 1941, he had murdered so many of his own military commanders that when Hitler suddenly invaded with 3 million Nazi soldiers, Russia had almost no experienced officers left to fight back. Look at this map. See these arrows pushing deep into Soviet territory from the west? That is Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. The Germans pushed so fast that within months they had surrounded the city of Leningrad and would keep it under siege for 900 days. Inside, civilians ate wallpaper paste and leather belts just to survive. Nearly 1 million people starved to death in that one city alone. The German army pushed all the way to the gates of Moscow itself, and then, of course, winter arrived.
Mein Führer, the Russians are not giving up. They will! It is minus 40 degrees. Our tank engines have stopped working. Then fight in the cold! Sir, our men's eyeballs are freezing. Try harder!
The Russians, used to this kind of cold, pushed the Germans back from Moscow, just like Napoleon 130 years earlier. Hitler had made the same catastrophic mistake. The fighting in the east became the bloodiest place on earth. At a single battle in the city of Stalingrad, 2 million people died. In one battle. Then, in 1943, came the largest tank battle ever fought, at a place called Kursk. Look at this map. 6,000 tanks smashed into each other across this stretch of Russian countryside. The Germans lost, and after Kursk, they would never go on the offensive in the east again. Slowly and painfully, the Red Army crushed the Germans and pushed them all the way back to Berlin. And here's something most people don't know. 4 out of every 5 German soldiers killed in the entire Second World War died fighting the Soviets. The famous beaches of Normandy got the movies. Russia did the heavy lifting. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in that war. 27 million. But Stalin's country came out of it as one of the most powerful nations on Earth, controlling half of Europe, holding the atomic bomb, and staring across the world at a brand new enemy, America. For 45 years after the war, the USSR and America stared at each other across the world with thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other's cities. This was called the Cold War. Now look at this map. See the world divided into two colors? Every country on Earth had to pick a side. It was extremely uncomfortable. Twice during those decades, the world came within hours of nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought both sides within 13 days from total nuclear war. And in 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov was alone in a bunker when his computer flashed that America had launched 5 nuclear missiles at the USSR. Protocol said fire back immediately. Petrov decided to wait, going on a hunch that it was probably a glitch. He was right. On that single night, the entire planet was saved by one man's gut feeling. Stalin died in 1953. The Soviet leaders who came after him were less murderous, but the country was quietly rotting. From the outside, the USSR looked huge and terrifying. From the inside, it was empty shops, broken factories, and people waiting in line for hours just to buy a single loaf of bread. By 1985, the whole system was being held together with vodka and prayer. A new leader called Mikhail Gorbachev took over and tried to save it all with 2 big ideas: open the country and reform the economy. It went badly.
Sir, we let people talk freely. Now they're saying things.
Good things?
No, sir. They're saying the whole government is a disaster.
Also, Poland just left, and East Germany, and Hungary.
Sir, the entire Soviet Union is breaking apart.
It wasn't supposed to happen. Look at this map. See this enormous red landmass that had dominated half the planet for 45 years? Watch it shatter into 15 separate countries almost overnight. In the end, the Soviet Union didn't go down with a war or a coup or any kind of dramatic last stand. On December 25th, 1991, the Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin for the very last time. The Russian tricolor went up in its place. No fanfare, no speeches, no grand ceremony, just one flag swapped for another on a quiet winter night. And just like that, the country that had defeated Nazi Germany, put the first man into space, and held half the planet at gunpoint for 45 years, simply ceased to exist. Russia was now a democracy on paper. The 1990s were total chaos. The economy collapsed, gangsters ran the streets, and old communists sold the country off to their friends for pennies on the dollar. Then, in 1999, a quiet former KGB agent called Vladimir Putin became president. He locked down the media, the courts, and his political rivals. Look at this map. In 2014, he annexed Crimea. By 2022, he had launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And he's still sitting in the Kremlin right now. And that is Russia. But here's the part most people don't understand. Everything that shaped Russia starts with the Mongols. If you skip that part, you're basically missing the entire story. Click here. This story gets insane. And I'll catch you next time.